The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as staff members hurried through their daily routines. Inside the royal mews, where the finest vehicles of the British monarchy were kept in pristine condition, something unusual was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension, though most of the workers didn't yet know why. Thomas Bennet had served as a royal guard for 17 years. He had seen monarchs come and go, witnessed historic moments, and stood his ground through protests and celebrations alike. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what was about to happen on this particular Tuesday morning in late autumn. The late Queen's personal Bentley state limousine sat gleaming in its designated spot. This wasn't just any vehicle. It was a symbol of Her Majesty's reign, a mobile piece of history that had carried the beloved monarch through countless state occasions, jubilee celebrations, and official visits. The deep claret paint shone under the soft lights of the mews, and the royal standard holder stood empty but dignified, waiting for a purpose that many believed should remain forever tied to its original owner. Camilla, now Queen Consort, had been adjusting to her new role since the passing of Queen Elizabeth. The transition had been difficult for everyone in the royal household. Staff members who had served the late Queen for decades found themselves navigating unfamiliar waters, trying to honor the memory of their former employer while serving the new generation of royals. On this morning, word had spread quickly through the palace corridors. Camilla had made a formal request through her private secretary. She wanted to use the late Queen's personal limousine for an upcoming state dinner. The request seemed straightforward on the surface, but it touched a nerve that ran deep through the hearts of those who had served Elizabeth for so many years. Margaret Hayes, the head of household staff, received the request first. She sat in her small office reading the formal letter 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. Margaret had worked at the palace for 32 years. She had helped the Queen prepare for countless events, had seen her in moments of joy and sorrow, and had developed a fierce loyalty that death had not diminished. The request put Margaret in an impossible position. Technically, the vehicles belonged to the royal household, and the new Queen Consort had every right to use them. But emotionally, spiritually even, that particular car felt sacred. It was more than metal and leather. It carried the essence of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to service, who had become a grandmother figure to an entire nation. Margaret knew she had to pass the request up the chain of command, but she also knew what the reaction would be. The guards who maintained the vehicles, the drivers who had transported the Queen, the staff who had polished every surface with loving care, they would not take this well. Thomas Bennet was in the guardroom when he heard the news. A younger colleague, James, burst through the door, his face flushed with emotion. The conversation that followed was heated. Some argued that traditions must evolve, that the royal family must move forward. Others insisted that some things were simply too soon, too raw, too precious to reassign. Thomas said little during the debate. He was a man of few words, but his silence carried weight. Those who knew him understood that he was processing something profound. The late Queen had personally thanked him once after he had stood guard during a particularly challenging protest. She had looked him in the eye and told him that people like him were the backbone of the institution. He had never forgotten that moment. The palace was divided. Younger staff members, more pragmatic and less emotionally attached to the old ways, saw no issue with the request. They pointed out that Camilla was doing her best in a difficult role, that she deserved access to the resources available to her position. Why should a perfectly good vehicle sit unused when it could serve a practical purpose? But the older guard, those who remembered the Queen in her prime, those who had witnessed her quiet dignity through decades of service, felt differently. To them, using her personal vehicle so soon after her passing felt like erasing her memory, like moving on before they had properly grieved. David Cole, the senior driver, was perhaps the most affected. He had driven the Queen in that very limousine hundreds of times. He knew the exact way she liked the temperature set, the particular angle at which she preferred the seat positioned. He had heard her gentle comments about the weather, her observations about the crowds, her occasional moments of humor that the public never saw. David was the one who had driven the limousine in the funeral procession. That journey had nearly broken him. Every turn of the wheel felt heavy with history, every mile marker a reminder of what the nation had lost. He had cleaned the car afterward with tears streaming down his face, knowing it might be the last time he performed that duty for his queen. When David heard about Camilla's request, he went pale. His colleagues found him in the garage, sitting in the driver's seat of the limousine, his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't need to say anything. His pain was visible, tangible, shared by many around him. The request had created an unexpected crisis. What should have been a simple administrative matter had become a flashpoint for grief, loyalty, and the complicated emotions surrounding change. The palace was discovering that moving forward was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Camilla herself was unaware of the storm brewing below stairs. Her request had been made through proper channels with no intention to cause distress. She was simply trying to fulfill her duties to represent the monarchy at important events. In her mind, using the available resources was practical and appropriate, but intention and impact are not always aligned. The request had touched something deeper than protocol, deeper than practicality. It had exposed the raw wound of loss that still ached in the hearts of those who had loved and served Queen Elizabeth. As the day progressed, the tension increased. Staff members whispered in corners. Guards exchanged meaningful glances. The household was fracturing along invisible lines, divided between those who believed in moving forward and those who felt that some things should remain untouched. At least for now, Thomas Bennet knew something had to give. He could feel it building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had seen enough palace politics to recognize when a situation was about to explode. The question was whether anyone in authority would recognize the depth of feeling before it was too late. The late Queen's limousine sat in its place, innocent and unaware of the controversy swirling around it. Its polished surface reflected the lights above, a silent witness to the human drama unfolding in its name. By evening, the entire household staff knew about the request. The news had spread like wildfire, carrying with it a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness. People began choosing sides, though many wished they didn't have to. The palace, usually a model of discretion and unity, was showing cracks that no amount of protocol could hide. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could not be avoided. Someone would have to respond to the request, and that response would send a message about what the new reign would value, what it would preserve, and what it would be willing to change. The next morning arrived with a cold bite in the air. Thomas Bennet had barely slept. He kept thinking about the Queen, about the dignity she had maintained through every challenge, about the way she had treated even the lowest-ranking staff member with respect and consideration. He thought about that limousine and what it represented. When he arrived at the Royal Mews, he found a group of guards and drivers already gathered. They stood in a loose circle, their breath visible in the chilly morning air, speaking in low voices. David Cole was at the center, his face drawn and tired. It was clear he hadn't slept either. The conversation stopped when Thomas approached. All eyes turned to him. He was respected among his peers, known for his steady judgment and unwavering loyalty. If Thomas had an opinion, people listened. Before anyone could speak, Margaret Hayes appeared at the entrance to the Mews. She looked uncomfortable, clutching a folder against her chest like a shield. Behind her stood Gerald Thornton, one of the palace's senior administrators. His presence meant official business, and everyone straightened slightly. Margaret's voice was strained when she spoke. The decision had been made at the highest levels, she explained. The Queen Consort's request would be granted. The late Queen's limousine would be prepared for the state dinner scheduled for the following week. It was presented as settled, final, not open for discussion. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he had never experienced in all his years of service. It wasn't just disagreement. It was a sense of betrayal, of watching something sacred being treated as merely functional. David Cole was the first to react. His voice, usually so controlled and professional, cracked with emotion. He asked how they could make such a decision so quickly, so carelessly. That car wasn't just a vehicle, he said. It was the Queen's sanctuary, her private space, the place where she had gathered her thoughts before facing the world. Gerald Thornton responded with administrative coolness. He explained that the royal household owned the vehicles, that they were assets to be utilized, that the monarchy must continue functioning. His words were logical, reasonable, but they landed like stones in water, creating ripples of resentment. Other voices joined in. A younger guard, emboldened by David's outburst, questioned the timing. Couldn't they wait longer? Couldn't they show more respect for the memory of someone who had given 70 years of service? Another driver pointed out that there were other vehicles available, other limousines that could serve the same purpose. Margaret Hayes looked torn. She agreed with the guards in her heart, but her position required her to enforce the decision. She tried to explain that the Queen Consort was within her rights, that they all needed to adapt to the new reality. Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Thomas had remained silent through the exchange, but he could feel the pressure building inside him. He thought about all the times he had stood guard, protecting not just physical security but something more intangible, the dignity and legacy of the institution he served. Was he supposed to simply abandon that now? The meeting was clearly meant to be brief, a simple announcement of a decision already made. But the guards weren't dispersing. They stood their ground, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. Gerald Thornton was beginning to look uncomfortable. This wasn't the smooth transition he had expected. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria Chen, one of the newer guards who had been silent until now, spoke up. She had only served for 3 years, but she had been present during the Queen's final public appearances. She described watching the Queen emerge from that limousine, tired but determined, still committed to her duty despite obvious frailty. Victoria's voice shook as she asked whether they had considered what the late Queen herself would have wanted. The question hung in the air. It was powerful because everyone knew the answer. Queen Elizabeth had been thoughtful about legacy, careful about symbols, deeply aware of what things meant to people. Would she have wanted her personal vehicle reassigned so quickly? Would she have prioritized practicality over sentiment? Gerald Thornton tried to regain control of the situation. He reminded everyone that they were servants of the crown, not individual royals. Their duty was to serve whoever held the position, regardless of personal feelings. His tone was becoming sharper, more authoritative, but it was having the opposite of the intended effect. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but in the tense silence, everyone heard him clearly. He said that he had taken an oath to serve the monarchy, and he had never broken that oath. But serving the monarchy, he believed, also meant protecting its dignity, its traditions, and the memory of those who had embodied its best qualities. Gerald Thornton's face reddened. He pointed out that Thomas was a guard, not a policymaker. His job was to follow orders, not to question decisions made by his superiors. The words were harsh, meant to put Thomas back in his place. But something had shifted in the dynamic. The other guards were nodding at Thomas's words. They recognized in his quiet statement something they all felt but had struggled to articulate. This wasn't about refusing to serve Camilla. It was about preserving something essential, something that once lost could never be recovered. David Cole stepped forward. He announced that he would not drive the limousine for the state dinner. His voice was firm despite the tremor in his hands. He had driven for the late Queen for 15 years, and he could not, in good conscience, treat her personal vehicle as just another car in the fleet. Margaret Hayes looked stricken. David's refusal was more than a personal statement. It was a direct challenge to authority, something that could have serious consequences for his career. She tried to reason with him, but he stood firm. One by one, other drivers spoke up. They supported David's position. None of them wanted to be the one to drive that particular car for this particular purpose. It felt wrong, disrespectful, premature. The United Front was forming spontaneously, organically, driven by shared grief and loyalty. Gerald Thornton was losing control of the situation. What had been meant as a simple briefing had become a near rebellion. He threatened consequences, reminded everyone of their positions and responsibilities, but his words were bouncing off a wall of determination. Thomas knew things were reaching a critical point. He suggested that they request a meeting with someone higher in the chain of command, someone who might better understand the emotional complexities involved. Perhaps if they could explain their feelings properly, a compromise could be reached. But Gerald Thornton was done compromising. He stated flatly that the decision was final, that the limousine would be prepared as requested, and that anyone refusing to do their duty would face disciplinary action. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret Hayes to deal with the aftermath. The guards and drivers stood in stunned silence. They had never collectively challenged authority like this before. The weight of what they were doing began to settle on their shoulders. These were people who valued their jobs, who took pride in their service, who had families to support. But they also had principles they weren't willing to abandon. Margaret Hayes looked at the group with tears in her eyes. She understood their position because she shared their feelings, but she also knew the reality of palace politics. Someone would have to back down, and it wouldn't be the administration. As the group slowly dispersed, Thomas felt both proud and troubled. They had made their feelings known, had stood up for something they believed in, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. The real confrontation was yet to come, and when it did, the consequences could be severe. David Cole remained by the limousine, his hand resting on its polished surface. He looked like a man saying goodbye to an old friend, knowing that the relationship had changed irreversibly. Thomas stood beside him in silent solidarity, two men bound by loyalty to a memory and uncertain about what the future would bring. News of the standoff spread through Buckingham Palace faster than anyone could have anticipated. By lunchtime, staff members from every department were whispering about the confrontation at the Royal Mews. The story grew with each retelling, taking on mythic proportions as it passed from person to person. In the kitchen, where royal meals were prepared with precision and care, the cooks debated the issue while chopping vegetables and stirring sauces. Some sided with the guards, praising their courage in standing up for the late Queen's memory. Others worried about the chaos that could result if everyone started questioning orders. The housekeeping staff, who maintained the pristine condition of the palace's countless rooms, had their own perspective. Many of them had personal memories of the late Queen. A kind word in a corridor, a grateful smile, a moment of unexpected warmth. They understood why the guards felt so strongly about protecting her legacy. Even in the administrative offices, where protocol and procedure usually reigned supreme, people were taking sides. Younger staff members, more focused on efficiency and modernization, argued that the guards were being sentimental and impractical. But older employees, those who remembered the Queen in her prime, quietly supported the protest. Thomas Bennet spent the afternoon at his usual post, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the morning's confrontation, wondering if they had done the right thing. The last thing he wanted was to cause problems for the monarchy he had devoted his life to serving. Yet how could he stand by and watch something precious be diminished? Around 3 in the afternoon, he was summoned to the office of Sir Edmund Hartley, the Lord Chamberlain himself. This was serious. Sir Edmund rarely dealt directly with guards unless something significant was at stake. Thomas walked through the ornate corridors with a mix of apprehension and determination. Sir Edmund's office was everything one would expect. Wood-paneled walls, portraits of former monarchs, an enormous desk that spoke of authority and tradition. The Lord Chamberlain himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, impeccably dressed with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He invited Thomas to sit, which was itself unusual. Guards typically stood when meeting with superiors, but Sir Edmund seemed to recognize that this conversation required a different approach. He didn't begin with reprimands or lectures. Instead, he asked Thomas to explain in his own words what had happened that morning. Thomas spoke carefully but honestly. He described the deep connection the staff felt to the late Queen, the symbolic importance of her personal belongings, and the sense that moving too quickly to reassign them felt disrespectful. He emphasized that no one wanted to cause problems or refuse legitimate orders, but that this particular request had touched a nerve that went beyond simple protocol. Sir Edmund listened without interruption. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. The Lord Chamberlain rose and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. He acknowledged that the transition had been difficult for everyone. The late Queen had been a constant presence for so long that her absence created a void no one quite knew how to fill. He understood, he said, the emotional attachments people had formed, but he also reminded Thomas that the monarchy was bigger than any individual, that it had to continue functioning regardless of personal feelings. Thomas listened respectfully but didn't back down. He pointed out that the monarchy's strength came partly from its connection to tradition and memory. Erasing too quickly the physical reminders of a beloved monarch might serve administrative efficiency, but it could damage the institution's emotional foundation. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. It was in many ways remarkable. A guard and the Lord Chamberlain, separated by decades and vast differences in rank, were having an honest discussion about values, loyalty, and the meaning of service. Both men emerged with greater respect for the other's perspective, even if they hadn't reached complete agreement. As Thomas left Sir Edmund's office, he knew that some kind of resolution would be required soon. The standoff couldn't continue indefinitely, but he also sensed that his words had been heard, that the concerns of the staff had been taken seriously at the highest levels. Meanwhile, David Cole was facing his own challenges. His supervisor had called him in for a formal meeting, warning him that refusing duty could result in termination. David understood the risk, but he remained firm in his position. He offered to take any other assignment, to work extra hours, to do whatever was needed, except drive that particular vehicle for this particular purpose. His supervisor was frustrated but also sympathetic. He had served the late Queen himself and understood David's feelings. But he was also bound by the chain of command, required to enforce decisions made above his pay grade. The meeting ended without resolution, with both men unhappy but unable to find a way forward. By evening, the story had leaked beyond the palace walls. A junior staff member, perhaps feeling strongly about the issue, had mentioned it to a friend who worked in media. Within hours, a reporter was making inquiries, trying to confirm details and understand the full story. The palace's press office went into damage control mode. This was exactly the kind of internal conflict they wanted to keep private. The public loved the royal family partly because of the carefully maintained image of unity and tradition. A story about staff members protesting the new queen consort's decisions could be damaging, particularly when public opinion about Camilla remained somewhat divided. Emergency meetings were called. Senior administrators debated how to handle the situation. Some argued for cracking down hard on the protesters, making an example of them to prevent future insubordination. Others counseled a softer approach, recognizing that forcing the issue could make things worse. The complexity of the situation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about a car or a dinner. It was about how the monarchy navigated change, how it balanced respect for the past with the needs of the present. It was about the relationship between those who served and those they served, about whether tradition meant anything beyond ceremonial function. Thomas received a phone call at home that evening from Margaret Hayes. Her voice was strained, exhausted. She warned him that the press had gotten wind of the story, that things were about to get much more complicated. She urged him to be careful about what he said and to whom, reminding him that his words could be twisted or taken out of context. He thanked her for the warning but felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps if the public knew what was happening, they could weigh in. The late Queen had been beloved by millions. Surely they would understand why her personal vehicle deserved special consideration, at least for a reasonable period of mourning. That night, the first news article appeared online. It was carefully worded using anonymous sources, but the basic facts were there. Staff members at Buckingham Palace were reportedly in conflict with the new Queen consort over the use of the late Queen Elizabeth's personal limousine. The story included background about the vehicle's significance and speculation about what the controversy revealed about tensions within the royal household. Social media erupted almost immediately. People who had mourned the Queen passionately took sides. Some supported the guards, praising them for defending her memory. Others criticized them for making things difficult for Camilla, who was just trying to do her job. The debate was fierce, emotional, and deeply divided. Within the palace, the reaction to the leak was swift and angry. An investigation was launched to find out who had spoken to the press. Security was tightened and staff members were reminded of their confidentiality agreements. The atmosphere became tense, with people afraid to speak openly, even to colleagues they trusted. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. What had started as a spontaneous expression of grief and loyalty had mushroomed into something much larger. People's careers were at risk. The reputation of the monarchy was being questioned. And at the center of it all was a vehicle that symbolized everything they had loved about their former queen. As he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Thomas wondered where this would all lead. Would they find a way to compromise, to honor both the past and the present, or would the confrontation escalate further, forcing everyone to choose between competing loyalties? The late Queen's limousine still sat in the royal mews, polished and pristine, waiting for a purpose that had become the subject of an unexpected and growing storm. The morning brought newspaper headlines that made palace administrators wince. "Palace in turmoil over late Queen's car," read one. "Royal Guard refuses Queen Consort's command," declared another. The story had captured public imagination in a way no one had predicted. Television morning shows devoted segments to the controversy. Royal commentators were wheeled out to provide analysis, each offering different perspectives on what the conflict meant for the monarchy's future. Some praised the guards for their loyalty and principle. Others condemned them for insubordination and for making Camilla's already difficult position even harder. The comment sections of online articles exploded with opinions. People shared their own memories of Queen Elizabeth, describing what she had meant to them and why her legacy deserved protection. Others argued that Britain needed to move forward, that clinging to the past served no one. The debate became a proxy for larger questions about change, tradition, and respect. Inside Buckingham Palace, the pressure was mounting. Senior administrators held emergency meetings, trying to find a path forward that would satisfy multiple competing interests. They needed to support the Queen Consort's authority, while also managing staff morale and public opinion. It was a nearly impossible balancing act. Camilla herself was reportedly distressed by the controversy. Sources close to her suggested that she had no desire to cause pain or disrespect to the late Queen's memory. The request for the limousine had been made casually, without understanding the emotional weight it carried. Now she found herself at the center of a storm she never intended to create. Thomas arrived at work to find reporters gathered outside the palace gates. They called out questions to any staff member entering or leaving. Security had been increased to keep them at bay, but their presence was a constant reminder that private matters had become very public. He made his way to the royal mews, where he found the atmosphere even more tense than before. Some guards looked defiant, energized by the public support their position was receiving. Others looked worried, concerned about the consequences of continued resistance. The unity of the previous day showed some cracks as the reality of the situation set in. David Cole looked exhausted. He confessed to Thomas that he had barely slept, worrying about his job and his family. He had a mortgage to pay, children to support. Could he really risk everything over a symbolic gesture? Yet every time he thought about backing down, he pictured the Queen's face and couldn't bring himself to compromise. Around mid-morning, all guards and drivers were summoned to a mandatory meeting. This time the room was packed with senior officials, including Sir Edmund Hartley. The atmosphere was formal, serious, and more than a little intimidating. Sir Edmund addressed the group with measured words. He acknowledged that the past few days had been difficult and emotional for everyone. He recognized the deep loyalty they felt toward the late Queen, and assured them that her memory was valued and respected by everyone in the royal household. But then his tone became firmer. He reminded them that the monarchy was an institution with rules and hierarchies for good reason. Individual staff members, regardless of how long they had served or how deeply they felt, could not override decisions made by their superiors. The Queen Consort had made a legitimate request, and it was their duty to fulfill it. He announced that the limousine would be prepared for the state dinner, as originally planned. Any staff member who refused to participate in this preparation would be subject to disciplinary action, up to and including dismissal. The message was clear. The time for protest was over. The room fell silent. Thomas could feel the energy shifting, sense people's resolve wavering under the weight of official authority and threat of consequences. He understood. These were good people with responsibilities and families. Asking them to sacrifice their livelihoods for a symbolic stand was too much. But just as the meeting seemed ready to conclude with grudging acceptance, Thomas did something unexpected. He stood up. The movement drew every eye in the room. Sir Edmund paused, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Thomas's voice was steady as he spoke. He said that he understood the position of the administration and respected the chain of command that made the monarchy function. But he also believed that some principles were worth standing for. even at personal cost. He announced that he would not participate in preparing the limousine for the state dinner. He would not stand guard over it, would not assist in its preparation, would not be part of treating the late Queen's personal vehicle as just another resource to be allocated. If that meant losing his job, he accepted that consequence. The boldness of his statement stunned the room. This wasn't angry defiance or emotional outburst. It was calm, principled refusal from a man who had served faithfully for 17 years. The sincerity and quiet courage of his stand was undeniable. Sir Edmund's face showed surprise and perhaps a touch of respect, though his words remained firm. He warned Thomas that he was making a serious mistake, that throwing away a distinguished career over this issue was foolish and unnecessary. He urged him to reconsider, but Thomas shook his head. He explained that his oath was to serve the crown with honor and dignity. In his judgment, using the late Queen's personal vehicle so soon after her passing when the nation was still mourning, compromised that dignity. He couldn't be part of it. Other guards watched this exchange with wide eyes. Thomas had always been respected but never particularly radical. Seeing him take such a stand gave some of them courage. David Cole stood up as well, announcing that he too would refuse to participate, whatever the consequences. Then Victoria Chen stood. Then 2 more guards. Then several drivers. Within moments, roughly half the people in the room were on their feet, standing in silent solidarity with Thomas's position. The administrators looked at each other in alarm. This was no longer a minor personnel issue. It was a genuine crisis that threatened to undermine the functioning of an essential part of the royal household. They couldn't fire half the Royal Mews staff without creating chaos. Sir Edmund called for a recess, and the senior officials retreated to confer privately. The guards and drivers who had stood remained standing, while those who had stayed seated looked uncomfortable, caught between sympathy for their colleagues and concern for their own security. Thomas felt surprisingly calm. He had made his decision based on principle, and whatever happened next he could live with himself. That was worth more than job security, more than the comfort of following orders without question. Margaret Hayes approached him during the break, tears in her eyes. She told him he was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish in equal measure. She wished there was another way but couldn't see what it might be. The situation had escalated beyond anyone's ability to easily resolve. When the officials returned, Sir Edmund's expression was grave. He announced that there would be no immediate disciplinary action, but that all guards and drivers needed to report to individual meetings with their supervisors over the next few days. Each person would have the opportunity to reconsider their position and discuss potential reassignments. It was neither a victory nor a defeat, but rather a postponement. The underlying issue remained unresolved, but at least no one was being fired on the spot. The administration was buying time, hoping that emotions would cool and a compromise could emerge. As the meeting dispersed, Thomas felt both relieved and anxious. They had made their point, had stood up for something they believed in, but the ultimate outcome was still uncertain. Would the limousine still be used for the state dinner? Would Camilla be informed of the depth of opposition her request had generated? Would anyone in authority recognize that this wasn't about insubordination, but about protecting something precious? That evening, the news reported on the dramatic confrontation at Buckingham Palace. Details had leaked again despite increased security. The public learned about Thomas's stand and the support he had received from his colleagues. Opinion polls showed that a majority of Britons sympathized with the guard's position, believing that more time should pass before the late Queen's personal items were reassigned. The pressure on the palace was mounting from all directions. They needed a resolution that would satisfy the staff, respect the Queen consort, honor the late Queen's memory, and maintain public confidence in the institution. It was a puzzle with no obvious solution, and time was running out. The palace corridors buzzed with nervous energy over the following days. Individual meetings were scheduled as promised, and guards found themselves sitting across from supervisors who looked as uncomfortable as they felt. These weren't typical disciplinary sessions. Everyone involved recognized they were navigating unprecedented territory. Thomas had his meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. His supervisor, Commander Richard Walsh, had worked alongside him for over a decade. The 2 men had mutual respect, which made the conversation particularly difficult. Richard didn't waste time with formalities. He asked Thomas directly if he understood the position he had put everyone in. The refusal to follow orders, regardless of motivation, created problems that rippled far beyond the immediate issue. Other staff members were watching to see what happened. Precedents were being set. Thomas acknowledged all of this. He had thought carefully about the implications of his actions, but he maintained that some situations required individuals to stand for principles even when it was uncomfortable or risky. The late Queen had embodied duty and service, and honoring her memory meant more than words. Richard sighed deeply. He admitted, speaking quietly and unofficially, that he understood Thomas's feelings. He too had served the late Queen and felt the wrongness of the situation. But as a commander, he had responsibilities beyond personal sentiment. He needed staff who would follow orders, who would maintain the discipline that allowed the royal household to function smoothly. The conversation went in circles for nearly an hour. Both men were trying to find a solution that didn't exist. Thomas couldn't compromise his principles. Richard couldn't overlook the challenge to authority. They parted without resolution, both frustrated and saddened by the impasse. Similar scenes played out across the royal mews over those days. Some guards and drivers, facing the reality of potential job loss, quietly backed down from their positions. Others remained firm, though the cost of their stand weighed heavily on them. Families were affected. Mortgages and school fees suddenly felt precarious. The abstract principle was colliding with concrete consequences. David Cole's meeting was particularly emotional. His supervisor pointed out that David had worked at the palace for 15 years without a single complaint against him. His record was exemplary. Was he really willing to throw all that away? David broke down in tears, explaining that he felt trapped between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to a woman who had treated him with kindness and respect throughout his career. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, more significant conversations were taking place. Sir Edmund Hartley had briefed King Charles directly about the situation. The king, newly settled into his role and dealing with countless pressures, now faced a crisis that touched on issues of memory, loyalty, and family dynamics. Charles had loved his mother deeply, but he also understood the position Camilla was in. She was trying to fulfill her duties as queen consort, and she needed support, not additional obstacles. Yet he also recognized that the staff's feelings came from genuine devotion to his mother's legacy. It was a situation with no clear villains, only competing loyalties. The king made a decision that surprised many. He requested a private meeting with Thomas Bennet. This was highly unusual. Monarchs rarely interacted directly with individual guards except in the most formal circumstances. But Charles had always been known for breaking with convention when he believed it necessary. Thomas received the summons with disbelief. He was to meet with the king himself in a private audience. He barely slept the night before, rehearsing what he might say, worrying about protocol, wondering what it all meant. The meeting took place in a small sitting room, far more intimate than the grand spaces where official business was usually conducted. King Charles was alone, without the usual retinue of advisors and officials. He gestured for Thomas to sit, immediately putting him at ease with a warm, genuine smile. The king began by thanking Thomas for his years of service. He mentioned specific events where Thomas had been on duty, demonstrating that he was aware of and appreciated the work done by those who served in less visible roles. The personal touch was disarming. Then Charles spoke about his mother. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described what she had meant to him, to the family, to the nation. He talked about her sense of duty, her compassion, her incredible strength. It was clear that his grief was still raw, his sense of loss profound. He acknowledged that the controversy over the limousine had opened up larger questions about how quickly things should change, about how to honor the past while moving forward. He confessed that he himself struggled with these questions daily, trying to be his own person while respecting his mother's legacy. Thomas listened, moved by the king's vulnerability and honesty. This wasn't the formal monarch speaking, but a son still mourning his mother and trying to navigate impossible complexities. Then the king asked Thomas to explain his position. He wanted to understand in Thomas's own words why this particular issue had become so important, what it represented beyond the immediate facts. Thomas spoke from the heart. He talked about the small moments of kindness the Queen had shown to staff members, the way she made everyone feel valued regardless of rank. He described the limousine not as a mere vehicle, but as a symbol of her presence, a tangible connection to someone who had been woven into the fabric of their daily lives for so long. He explained that using it so soon, before the mourning period felt complete, seemed to erase her too quickly from the spaces she had occupied. It wasn't about denying Camilla her due or refusing to accept change. It was about needing time to adjust, to grieve, to find ways to honor memory while moving forward. The king listened intently, nodding occasionally, his eyes reflecting understanding and pain. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. Charles rose and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens his mother had loved. Finally, he spoke. He said that Thomas's loyalty and devotion were exactly what his mother had inspired in people throughout her reign. Those qualities were precious and shouldn't be punished. At the same time, he reminded Thomas that the monarchy needed to function, that Camilla deserved respect and support in her role. Then the king made an unexpected proposal. What if they found a middle ground? The limousine could be retired from regular use for a period of 1 year, a formal mourning period for vehicles associated personally with the late queen. During that time, it would be maintained and preserved, but not used for state occasions. After a year, its future would be reassessed based on circumstances and feelings at that time. As for the upcoming state dinner, Camilla would use a different vehicle from the royal fleet, one equally suitable but without the same personal associations. The king would personally explain the decision to her, framing it not as a defeat but as a compassionate recognition of the staff's grief and the need for a transition period. Thomas was stunned. This was more than he had hoped for, a genuine compromise that acknowledged the validity of the staff's feelings, while also maintaining the dignity and authority of the royal family. It wasn't permanent, but it provided the time and space that everyone needed. The king asked if this solution would be acceptable to Thomas and his fellow guards. Thomas assured him it would be, that it represented exactly the kind of respectful balance they had hoped someone would recognize. As Thomas stood to leave, the king did something remarkable. He extended his hand for a handshake, a gesture of equality and respect that transcended rank and protocol. He thanked Thomas again for his service and for helping him understand an important truth about loyalty and memory. Walking back through the palace corridors, Thomas felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted. The crisis wasn't completely over. Details would need to be worked out, people informed, procedures established. But the fundamental conflict had been resolved in a way that honored everyone involved. He thought about the late queen and smiled. She would have approved of her son's solution, he felt certain. She had always valued compassion and understanding, always sought ways to bridge divides rather than widen them. In handling this crisis, Charles had demonstrated that he had learned those lessons well. The announcement of the king's decision was made through official channels the following morning. A carefully worded statement explained that out of respect for the late queen's memory, and in recognition of the continued mourning period, certain personal items closely associated with Her Majesty would be preserved and not used for state functions for a period of 1 year. The late queen's personal limousine was specifically mentioned. The statement further explained that this decision reflected the deep affection in which Queen Elizabeth was held by both the royal family and the staff who had served her. It emphasized that Queen Consort Camilla fully supported this period of reflection and remembrance, and that she had personally endorsed the compromise. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. News outlets praised the king for his sensitivity and wisdom in handling a delicate situation. Commentators noted that the decision demonstrated a modernized monarchy that could listen to its staff and respond with compassion rather than rigid authority. Social media, which had been fiercely divided over the issue, largely united in approval. People appreciated that the controversy had been resolved in a way that honored tradition, respected grief, and showed that ordinary workers' feelings mattered even in the highest echelons of society. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The tension that had gripped the royal muse for days dissolved into relief and gratitude. Guards and drivers who had stood their ground felt validated, their loyalty recognized rather than punished. Those who had worried about the consequences of the protest breathed easier. knowing their colleagues wouldn't face dismissal. David Cole was one of the first to hear the official news. He stood by the limousine one more time, but now his tears were of relief rather than anguish. The vehicle would remain exactly where it was, cared for and preserved, a testament to the woman who had occupied it with such grace. Margaret Hayes called a meeting of all household staff involved in the controversy. She read the king's statement aloud, her voice wavering with emotion. When she finished, spontaneous applause broke out. It wasn't just about the limousine anymore. It was about feeling heard, about having their devotion to the late queen acknowledged and respected. Thomas received personal thanks from numerous staff members. They recognized that his willingness to take a stand, to risk his career for principle, had made the difference. Without his quiet courage, the issue might have been forced through, leaving lasting resentment and division. But Thomas deflected the credit. He reminded everyone that it wasn't any individual's stand that had mattered, but the collective expression of loyalty and love. They had all played a part, and the king had responded not to one man's protest but to the genuine feelings of many devoted servants. The individual meetings that had been scheduled were quietly canceled. There was no longer any need for disciplinary discussions or forced reconsiderations. The compromise had removed the need for anyone to back down or sacrifice their position. Commander Richard Walsh sought out Thomas privately. He admitted that he had been troubled by the entire situation, caught between his duty to enforce orders and his sympathy for the staff's position. The king's solution had relieved him of an impossible burden. He shook Thomas's hand and said that the palace needed more people willing to speak truth to power, not fewer. A few days later, Camilla herself made a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. She visited the royal mews personally, something queen consorts rarely did without a formal reason. She spoke with guards and drivers, thanking them for their service and expressing her understanding of their feelings about the late queen. She explained, with genuine emotion, that she had never intended to cause pain or disrespect. The request for the limousine had been made without full awareness of its symbolic importance. She was still learning, still adjusting to her role, and she appreciated their patience during this transition. Her words were simple and sincere. She spoke about her own affection for Queen Elizabeth, her awareness that she could never replace such a beloved figure, and her hope that they could all work together to serve the monarchy's best interest while honoring its past. The visit wasn't publicized or turned into a media event. It was a private moment of connection and reconciliation. When Camilla left, many of the guards and drivers felt a new respect for her. She had shown humility and grace under difficult circumstances, qualities that reminded them, in a way, of the late queen herself. The state dinner proceeded as planned, with Camilla arriving in a different royal vehicle. The evening was a success, the controversy having no impact on the actual diplomatic function the event was meant to serve. But everyone involved knew that something more important had been accomplished in the days leading up to it. The crisis had forced the palace to confront questions about change and continuity, about how to move forward while respecting the past. The resolution had demonstrated that the monarchy could adapt, could listen, could find compromises that honored multiple perspectives. In the weeks that followed, life at Buckingham Palace returned to normal routines, but something had shifted subtly in the culture. Staff members felt a bit more empowered to voice concerns, knowing that they might actually be heard. Administrators were more conscious of the emotional dimensions of their decisions, recognizing that efficiency and protocol weren't the only values worth considering. The late Queen's limousine remained in its place at the Royal Mews, visited occasionally by staff members who wanted a moment of connection with her memory. It was cleaned and maintained with loving care, waiting for the day when its future would be decided. Thomas Bennet returned to his regular duties, standing guard at his assigned posts, performing his responsibilities with the same dedication he always had. But colleagues noticed a subtle change in him. He seemed more confident, more at peace with himself, as though standing up for his principles had strengthened something essential in his character. One evening, near the end of a long shift, Victoria Chen approached him. She thanked him for giving her and others the courage to stand up for what they believed in. She said that watching him take a principled stand had taught her something important about service, that it wasn't just about following orders, but about protecting the values and traditions that made the monarchy meaningful. Thomas smiled and told That real service sometimes meant difficult choices, but that those choices were easier when guided by genuine love and respect for the institution and the people who embodied it. The late Queen had taught them all that through her example, and honoring her meant living by those lessons. As the months passed, the controversy faded from public attention. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other dramas. But for those who had lived through those intense days at Buckingham Palace, the memory remained vivid and meaningful. The crisis over the limousine had become a story told to new staff members, an example of how the palace had navigated a difficult transition. It was told with pride, as evidence that the monarchy could evolve without losing its soul, that tradition and progress weren't always in opposition. King Charles occasionally reflected on those days. The situation had been one of his first major challenges as monarch, and how he had handled it had set a tone for his reign. He had learned that listening was sometimes more important than commanding, that flexibility could be a form of strength rather than weakness. The late Queen's limousine stood in the royal mews, silent and elegant, a physical reminder of her presence and legacy. It was more than a vehicle now. It had become a symbol of love, loyalty, and the power of standing up for what mattered. David Cole still checked on it regularly, though now with less pain and more fond remembrance. He would run his hand along its polished surface and remember the woman who had sat in its back seat, who had treated him with kindness, who had shown the world what dedication to duty truly meant. As the one-year period drew closer to its end, there were quiet discussions about the limousine's future, but everyone agreed that there was no rush. The vehicle had served its purpose during the crisis, not by transporting anyone, but by bringing people together, by forcing important conversations, by reminding everyone that the monarchy was about more than ceremony and protocol. It was about people, about memory, about the bonds formed through shared service and devotion. The late Queen had understood that. Her son was learning it, and the staff who had stood up for her memory had taught it to everyone willing to listen. The story of the controversy would be remembered not as a moment of rebellion or conflict, but as proof that the British monarchy could face its challenges with humanity, wisdom, and respect for all involved. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest tribute to Queen Elizabeth's legacy, that even in her absence, she continued to inspire the best in those who served the crown. The limousine waited patiently, a silent guardian of memory, a symbol of continuity in a changing world, a testament to the power of loyalty and the importance of honoring what has been loved and lost.